242-4877. Oh, there's Mandy.
Meg's here.
Okay. It's here. Whoop. I'm in trouble if I'm running this thing. Sorry. Oh, okay, Mandy here. Okay, Mandy, why don't you go ahead then? Do you have a list?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do the roll call just in case so that there's a quorum.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Thanks.
Okay. Mr. Weddleton,
Here.
Miss Kennedy,
Here.
Mr. Peterson, Mr. Constant,
Here.
Mr. Dunbar, Miss Zalatel,
Here.
Miss Quinn Davidson. Here. Okay. Chairs, you have a quorum?
All right, thank you. So today, sorry, I sent out email with a document. Did everybody get that Word document?
I got
With
it.
some, hang on. Did people get the Word doc that I sent out that just has some brainstorming on possible conditional use parameters?
I did not. This concept.
I did not, John. Yeah, this is
Okay.
Crystal. I didn't get that either.
Okay. Let me,
Yeah, it only went to Austin and myself, John, along with Dean.
is that right? Oh,
Jake,
shoot.
and others. Yeah,
Did
only two
Gates
other
get
assembly
it?
members. Dean did, yes.
Okay. Okay, Constant and Meg, did you get it?
Yes.
Meg, you had some things you were working on. Did you send those around, or is it something you just want to?
It's only been discussed. I don't have anything necessarily written up because we had stalled the conversation on shelter regulation when we had heard that the advisory council to the coalition was taking it up. But there seems to maybe be a new sense of urgency.
Okay. I think on this, if we, Jason, is Jason here, Pocketstep?
I am.
Okay, good. So, we've got the ordinance to allow homeless and transient shelters in B3 and everything. Okay, well, what's that going to look like? We want to make sure they're good and not damaging. So, it would be nice to have writing along with that something that says these are conditional use parameters we're thinking of. And my understanding is that what we were driving at our previous meeting. Does anyone see it different? Chris, Austin?
If that's an open question to anybody.
The goal.
Dean?
That's right. I think that's right. Their use standards for homeless shelters just has definition, nothing else. And I think that's what we are kind of missing here, or some parameters for the homeless shelters, and maybe something specific about what needs to be part of the conditional use. So right now, the only thing there is a definition of what is a homeless shelter. If you look up the other community uses in Title 21, also under the community uses category, there's the adult care services and child care and so forth. And all of them have rather, well, sometimes some extensiveness, there be specific standards. And some of them I noted were like, where the use is adjacent to residential, then it requires L2 or L3 landscaping for a buffer, stuff like that. And I think that that's the kind of thing that would be desirable. If, for example, a homeless shelter in B3 is adjacent to residential. or maybe there should be some specific type of security fencing or landscaping if it's adjacent to anything. I don't know, but that's the discussion I think that we need and that this ordinance is lacking in. And then, John, something you said also sparked something I was thinking. So if we look at marijuana and our marijuana code in Title 21, it says that the marijuana use needs to comply with the licensing standards in Title 10. And I'm thinking that maybe this would gel with the project that Meg and worked with her on with homelessness regulations. We were looking at putting licensing regime in place in Title 16. So maybe this Title 21 could refer to, and since we don't have it yet, any licensing regulations required by this code. And then if we enact licensing standards later, that would be part of, I guess, the requirements for the use to comply with the licensing standards that we might enact. I don't know, is this all too hypothetical?
No, that's important. Thanks, Dean.
Mr. Chair, if I might.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Dean.
Go ahead.
I think that second part that you hit on right there is the part that I'm most interested in the contemplation of the marijuana and the alcohol industries as a model. In creating the marijuana licenses, we created a dual licensing process with the state. So we have a local license and we have the land use permit. What we found in the past is that the conditional use or land use permit, whatever you want to call it, is effectively irrevocable and means that the neighborhood will only have to swallow whatever abuses that the provider wants to make happen into the community because the city has no leverage. And so I am very hopeful that we craft a licensure that can be revoked and that would end their ability to operate should they not meet the standard. And so if we can move to that direction and pretty swiftly, hopefully based on Meg's preliminary work, we can achieve a product that is easy to defend in the community, or much easier, if not easy.
John, this is Meg. Can I say something about
And,
that
perhaps
Sure.
after Dean?
Okay, Dean, do you want to follow up?
Oh, I was just going to say perhaps easier to monitor and compel voluntary compliance with licensing standards. If we have that, at least we would have more teeth, I think, or a process that's more efficient with having teeth that might be needed for these uses. And I think gentle teeth, because we all want homeless shelters. We need them. So we don't want the teeth that makes it like shut down too easily. Anyway, sorry, go ahead, Meg.
Meg?
Thanks, Dean. So I had the chance to talk about this with planning, Chris Schutte, and the like. And Chris did a really great job with a very simple whiteboard graphic of explaining the interaction between what would occur to control what's happening inside the building versus then outside on the property. And so the Title 21 piece is what's happening on the property, but what happens, I think while it's two different regulatory schemes, I think it's really important to keep in mind that what happens in the building or the building operations obviously often affect what's happening outside on the property and outside of the building. So what we had talked about was a Title 21 hybrid approach that would be a conditional use / special land use permit. And it would really get to this idea of what Chris Constant has said, and I think what John has raised, which is ensuring there aren't neighborhood effects, or if there are, having some way to review those. But then if you take that and do that without some kind of standards for inside the building, I think we're only doing half the work. So while I think Dean has a elegant, quick solution, which is to say that you'd be subject to licensing requirements, those are only going to deal with what's likely inside the building unless we explicitly extend them out further. So those are some initial thoughts I have. I can tell you the licensing regulations are about half done. and haven't been out to providers yet because there was that work group of providers doing their own guidelines for operations as part of the continuum of care requirements under HUD. So I had put that on pause.
Okay, Meg, just to clarify, so what would be the vehicle for doing rules and regulations for what goes on inside the building? Is that health department or what?
Yes, that's correct. It would be health department enforcement. There is in the draft some coordination to still make sure all departments sign off on a license, very much like we do in marijuana and alcohol, like that everything's good to go because there are some fire requirements. We would want the police to sign off if there were an excess of 880 calls or something like that. But that was the vision.
And was this like you contemplating an annual license renewal?
Yeah, annual, which was the idea, and possibly, I really was looking at marijuana as the template, something that could or be perceived at least as having big negative neighborhood impacts by the public. And so how that was put together, I think, was done to mitigate those. And I think it's a very successful licensing scheme. We just have to balance the fact that that is a license and an operation that comes with substantial revenue versus what a shelter is. And but if the municipality is funding shelter operations at any level, that's another consideration to make as well.
Okay, got it. I'm watching chat, so if people want to cue chat as a fine way to do it. Chris, were you in?
A few things there. We know that the 880 code will not be useful at all in this, so we shouldn't rely on that because every effort to incorporate any kind of a nonprofit under this rule has met with swift and aggressive opposition and is impossible to change. At this time, it's been up 3 times, it's not changing. And so don't rely on that as my advice. And to Dean's point that we want gentle teeth, no, we want a gentle beast with very sharp teeth. We want teeth that will actually work if they need to, but don't have to be used. And so that to me is a philosophical difference of approach. I don't want to get to the point where we again have a scenario where we have meaningless words that don't have any effect. Because that's been the experience for a generation.
Yeah, sure. Crystal, are you done, Chris? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, Crystal.
Yeah, thanks, John. I hate to drag everybody backwards a little bit on this, but I want to make sure that I'm on the same wavelength with everybody and just in the terminology. And, we've got this big ordinance in front of us that has 4 different buildings, 4 different facilities that are going to be basically used in 4 different ways. And so my question is, are we actually talking only about the typical homeless shelter that we know Brother Francis is, or are we trying to kind of meld all of these 4 facilities into one thing that would have them all be under the same code? So, and I ask that question because I think we have other treatment centers that are probably already, we can have treatment centers. We have them, private ones. So anyway, like I said, it's kind of a real basic question, and but are we talking the typical homeless shelter where it's an overnight shelter, a very temporary thing, or are we trying to lump all these facilities into one way of addressing the code issues with them? And I don't care who answers that. I don't know who's got the better vision on this, but that's kind of my question. I want to make sure I'm working with the same terminology that everybody else is.
I think that's a question
So,
to
Mr.
Jason.
Chairman, this is Chris Schutte, the Director of Economic Development. I've got, I can't see all of the attendees in the meeting, but I believe that we have Michelle McNulty, the Planning Director, in here who can speak to this at greater length, Assemblymember Kennedy. But in essence, that question that you have asked is an interesting one, but it's 2 separate items. And the item in front of this body is about a zoning change that would allow overnight homeless shelters in the B3 zoning as a conditional use. The items that you listed, or the ordinance that you referenced, is tied to a proposal from the administration to acquire 4 separate properties for 4 separate uses. And only one of those uses is contemplated in the near term to be a overnight homeless shelter. So the B3 ordinance that this body is discussing today really only applies to one of those proposed acquisitions. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Chris.
Uh,
It's still,
Yeah,
I guess, Chris, you could pop, but I think, there are different visions for a homeless shelter. I mean, there's, Brother Francis, which is just, floor space, some bunks and so on, a little bit of medical, and they feed them. And then there is the homeless campus, which is kind of what we were dipping our toe into over at the Sullivan, which is, a place to sleep, but also you have the services right there. And the vision I have, I went and saw this at Omaha. They had 2 campuses that had all the services together: daytime, drug recovery, mental illness, job placement, so on, everything together. And they're incredibly effective. And so and they weren't ghettos. You didn't even know they were there. So that's my vision. And is that, I don't know, to Chris or Shooty or someone, what are you thinking when you think homeless shelter then?
So, Mr. Chairman, this is Chris Shooty. The B3 code change in front of us is specific to homeless, overnight homeless or transient shelter. And Dean is posting the code citation from Title 21 in the chat if you'd like to read through it. The facilities that you described fit that category, and some of the other uses that occur at those facilities are important parts of the whole, but strictly from the zoning perspective, the primary use would remain an overnight shelter, transient shelter. So while there can be multiple functions that occur at a campus, Mr. Chairman, in the eyes of the zoning code, what we're really talking about is overnight homeless and transient shelter, and whether or not it should be allowable as a conditional use in zoning districts aside from PLI.
Okay, Michelle?
okay.
I just want to maybe add a little bit to that. So I think to your point about there being different types of homeless facilities or homeless shelters that might provide other uses. So treatment centers are either going to be considered habilitative care if they're a residential overnight facility, or a health service if it's an outpatient. Those will not be affected by the ordinance allowing homeless shelters in the B3 zoning district. However, that goes forward. And you can have multiple uses. So if you had a shelter or a building that was providing both treatment facility or treatment center, if homeless shelter was an allowed use, it could also provide that. It would just need to go through the appropriate approval channels. I don't know if that helps with the dialogue.
Okay, well, this definition includes, besides shelter, medical, clothing needs, directly or referral approach. So it has some of those things. So, okay, I think, was Crystal, were you done?
Well, I guess I just wanted to add that, I think that's what's making this a little more complicated, because I can see where the conversation is morphing into more than what we thought it was. And when you talk about this with people in the community, they're lumping it all together. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out is, are we doing that too? Or are we really trying to keep things separate? And we just have to make sure that the public doesn't get confused on what's actually happening here.
My sense here is more like Chris Shooty said, is we should focus on homeless shelter and transient shelter in B3, and then we'll try to make it clear to the public. Meg, you wanted to follow up?
Excuse me. Yes, please. Yeah, so I think that's, I agree with Chris Shooty, and it was contemplated excuse me, when I was working on the shelter regulation project to want to open up shelter into B3. I think this isn't something necessarily at all attached to the potential property purchases. This is something that if we look at kind of what our shelter scheme is in Anchorage and what we need to make shelter successful, B3 is the place that it's at. It's where you can access a bus route often. It's connected or usually in proximity to other services. And I've been trying to be clear that even if currently zoned a different way, that particularly the rescue mission and Clare House are in otherwise B3 zoning areas. And so that this isn't really unprecedented, and that it's a multi-step process. Simply being allowed to move into B3 doesn't mean that a shelter will automatically be approved. So I guess I want to make sure that we definitely kind of keep this line between what we're talking about for the zoning change and then the proposed property purchases. Yes, one may be in a transient homeless and transient shelter, may be going into B3, but that isn't the impetus necessarily for the zoning change.
Okay, good. Thank you. So, given where we are with this, I mean, we have just a simple thing that adds homeless and transient shelters to B3, but clearly we want them to be done well, and that's why we're looking at conditional use parameters. So, partly so if something's done, they have these parameters in front of them, and also to calm people, I think, as we go forward with this. So Chris or Jason or Michelle, I mean, so you have, Michelle, did you get this write up I did? And, well, I guess we could start with the simplest thing is that the Sullivan Arena, they had some trouble, then they created and publicized this good neighbor policy. And my understanding talking to neighbors is that was done fairly effectively. So is that a starting point for parameters on a homeless shelter?
Through the chair, this is Chris Schutte. So I think the ideas that you put forward in the conditional use document are certainly helpful discussion or helpful items for discussion around what allowable conditions could be. It's tough to say at this point, Mr. Chairman, because each facility will be specific to the location, and a lot of the conditions, I think, will need to reflect that. So in other words, is your draft conditional use list good for a homeless and transient shelter that's located at, say, the Clitheroe facility, if that were ever a possibility? I think we would say, well, probably not hourly patrols because it's so far removed. But as far as providing a place to start discussing what acceptable conditions could be, I thought it was very helpful. But it will depend on the individual facilities and the locations thereof. I do think that as part of this discussion around the ordinance in front of the body to allow homeless and transient shelters as a conditional use in B3, there's a little bit of, I think all of the concerns you've heard voiced today from assembly members about the impact of these facilities on neighbors are 100% valid and should be addressed, whether that's through a new special land use permit process or changes to the existing conditional use permit code language. However, I don't know that that's going to happen via this ordinance. And I think it should be discussed and worked on through the community in the way that other Title 21 changes are worked on, and in the way, for example, that the special land use permit requirements around marijuana establishments were discussed in the public, in the community. So I think that that's a good direction to go. I don't know that we'll be able to encapsulate all of those concerns in this discussion today. But I 100% agree that it's a good direction to go. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Just comment. Dean, you put in the chat to send you the good neighbor things, and that was in that document that I emailed, that Word doc. It's under operator commitment and says enforce good good neighbor.
You sent, John?
Yeah, and I just pulled it straight off a sign that was in front of it.
Okay. I got it.
So Chris, we could do it as a separate thing. If we do purchase the old Alaska Club on Tudor and make that a homeless shelter, and then 2-3 months from now, come forward with kind of additional things in Title 21 or perhaps other places that say, here's our expectations, for conditional use. For homeless shelter, is it too late? Could they apply to one that would be at the old Alaska Club?
So through the chair, under the current Title 21 provisions, even if this ordinance were to pass, the Alaska Club, if an operator wanted to apply for the conditional use permit to operate an overnight and transient shelter, that probably wouldn't occur for a very long time after the purchase is complete. I think given the current dialogue, we can absolutely ensure that does not happen until the Assembly and the public and the Planning and Zoning Commission have had a chance to weigh in on potential changes to Title 21 as it relates to conditional use permits, or as Assemblymember Zalatow described, a new special land use permit. We can absolutely work with that.
Okay, they wouldn't be grandfathered in. I mean, well, tell me this, if we did something like this, how would it impact Brother Francis?
So through the chair, I'm sorry, I didn't know if I cut somebody else off.
Well, go ahead, Chris.
So through the chair, this would not impact Brother Francis Shelter. The B3.
If we came out with, I guess the B3 wouldn't, but if we came out with an ordinance that said, here's what we're looking for homeless shelter, some conditional use standards and so on, would those wouldn't really apply to Brother Francis unless they apply for a new conditional use. Is that correct?
So this is Michelle McNulty. That's correct. Anybody that has an approved CUP up until the point that any new ordinance is adopted, they would be technically grandfathered in under those old requirements and process. However, as you just stated, if they went to do a change to their campus, they would be subject to the new CUP process.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Any comments from the rest of the committee here?
Yep, I'm in the queue.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Go ahead, Chris.
So, Chris, what I just heard you say was effectively that with this process, we can't get requirements, but before the shelter would be operational, we would be able to get requirements through another process. Is that a fair summary?
Through the chair, yeah, I believe that's totally obtainable, and I think it's the outcome that the body's interested in seeing.
So then that argues for not passing this ordinance.
Through the chair, no, not necessarily, because the change at some point still needs to occur. Currently, homeless shelters are not even allowed as a conditional use in B3.
Absolutely, but what you're saying is if we want to require restrictions that are going to protect the community, we can get there after we pass this. But then you're saying, no, we need to pass this without the protections for the community. And so to me, I can't support this without the protections for the community because I have too long lived under the shadow of all this failure and abuse. And so that's the conundrum. And what I hear from you clearly is we can get there before we need it. And so why would we jump the shark and do this before we have the protections, all of which we could get done before we need it? What's the rationale?
Yeah, through the chair. So there are two different areas of Title 21 that would need to be revised. And the allowable use, or the conditional use, I'm sorry, in B3 can happen today or soon. And you're absolutely right that if an applicant were to come in for a homeless or transient shelter in B3 prior to the body adopting future changes to either the special land use permit code or the conditional use code, they would fall under the existing provisions for applying for and receiving a conditional use permit, which are very lengthy. But I think the punchline being that it does not come back before the Assembly for review and approval of that conditional use permit, which, as I understand it, is the outcome that the Assembly is interested in getting.
That's one of two outcomes, Chris. One outcome is, yes, finding its way back before us for final approval. But the other is instituting protections based on our experience that would, I think the term Michelle uses, be use-specific standards, but mostly those are Title 21 related. We have public safety, we have a variety of other standards that we need to be looking at. And so I just can't see how we don't have to dive in effectively and quickly to answer all these questions before we pass this. Because you just said it again, yes, they could be coming in underneath the current standards if they file that paperwork application the day after we pass this, but a month before we pass any protections, then they're grandfathered because they have their application in under the current rules, and the current rules are proven failure.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Dean, you had a question?
Yeah, Chris Schutte, you had mentioned that this ordinance should have a community discussion and input, and wondered how do you see that occurring, I guess, for July 14th for the public hearing? Did you have some additional process in mind?
Through the chair, Mr. Gates, specifically, I was referring to any ordinance to modify the Title 21 provisions on conditional use permits or a new special land use permit. I believe that discussions around those two Title 21 changes should go through the normal Title 21 text amendment process, which does involve multiple opportunities for public engagement and public discussion.
Yeah, do you mean before the Planning and Zoning Commission as well as the Assembly when it's a code amendment to Title 21?
Correct.
But we're going through half of it.
That is, through the chair, that is correct.
I kind of wanted
the normal text amendment process for Title 21.
Anything else, Dean?
So, are you suggesting we shouldn't waive Planning and Zoning Commission review? And then I had a thought about that is maybe if, I mean, there's time for July 14th. I don't know their meeting schedule, but is it possible the Planning and Zoning Commission might be able to send up a resolution with their comments on the ordinance before July 14th? It would kind of moot the idea that, or the point about, or the objection to waiving their review if they're able to at least send something to the Assembly before 14th.
Sure, through the chair. Again, Mr. Gates, I'm speaking specifically to the proposal to create new conditional use permit processes or a new special land use permit.
Yeah.
Neither of which exist yet. That's specifically what I'm referring to when I say that the process should follow the normal Title 21 process.
Okay.
Chris Schutte, how long would that take?
6 months.
Through the chair, the typical process for a text amendment for Title 21 can run up to 6 months.
All right. I'm sorry, Dean, did you have more?
No, but I'm not sure if we're suggesting we should drop the Planning and Zoning Commission review waiver and go through that normal process, or are we suggesting stick with the waiver of Planning and Zoning Commission review? I mean, what's the administration's view?
Sure. So through the chair, specific to this ordinance, the 2020-58, allowing the conditional use of homeless and transient shelters in the B3, we do not believe it needs to go to planning and zoning and follow the normal text amendment process. But I do believe that the more in-depth conversations around neighborhood concerns and protections that Assemblymember Constant highlighted that could result in new conditional use permit processes or a new special land use permit type are much more far-ranging and far-reaching, and I think would benefit from going through the typical process for Title 21 amendments, including PZC and Assembly review.
All right.
Okay.
Any
thanks.
more? Okay. Meg, were you in the queue?
Not right now. Thanks.
Okay.
I was, thank
Meg?
you. So it's good to have an idea of the timeline to send it through planning and zoning. I think because I'm not comfortable with, and I think others might be as well as what I'm hearing, with just a conditional use permit. I don't believe that it's necessarily wise or prudent to move forward with just adding these to the table under B3 with a conditional use. Excuse me. because even if the planning and someone walk through this with me, but even if we get down a path with planning and zoning on a special land use, conditional use permit process, hybrid, one or the other, site specific conditions, and we go down that route, if we need to put a shelter online before then, let's say because we need to close the Sullivan Arena, we can still use the emergency shelter provisions that we passed by ordinance previously, and like the Downtown Hope Center is operating under. And then when the new process came on, make the shelters subject to that process.
I think that's a question. Chris, Michelle, Jason?
Could I add a nuance to that question?
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks. I would just like to hear from Michelle exactly what framework she imagines we could put around all of this to add protections if we were to try to move forward. So that builds on Meg's question.
So Christopher, this is Michelle McNulty. As you mentioned, there's the use specific standards, so it could be moving forward with this ordinance as written with the inclusion of use specific standards as maybe outlined in Assemblyman Weddleton's paper. In order for anyone other than Planning and Zoning Commission to see a conditional use permit, that's a considerable change, because we actually have to go back to 2103 to the approval process. And that's not only changing and including the assembly as a reviewing body, but also looking at where the appeals would go. So that's a substantial change. And I've been trying to look for it while everybody was talking, but I actually know that there's a section in code that speaks to about when you're changing a board or commission, making changes to their board and their process. I believe that we have to go back to them, but I'm trying to look for that exact reference to get that information. But just to speak to your initial question, I think your best foot moving forward would be using site-specific or use-specific standards. I don't know, I would probably need to look through to the attorneys if we could, as a use-specific standard, have something in there that states that a CUP would go to the assembly for review, maybe as, in this capacity, it might be as a non-public hearing. There may be a way to do that, but I'd want the attorneys to weigh in on that.
Thank you. Chris, did you have more?
Are you asking me, Mr. Chairman?
Well, actually, I was thinking Constant, if you want to follow up,
do.
but Chris, do
I do.
you have something?
Use-specific standards. The initial implication that I heard from the presentation is that those really have to be to deal with landscaping and other buffer issues, but not with the more substantive elements that I'm sorry, and also Meg's question did get lost, and I'm sorry, Meg. We need to come back to that. My question on that is, are there ways we can get to the negative impacts through those use-specific standards? Because I don't really care about trees. In fact, what we find is the trees get cut down around these properties.
Right. And kind of as I talked about last week, I think we can get, possibly you could have one that requires annual reporting. I know that I did hear what you said about that and your concerns about the effectiveness of that last week. But that would be a tool. I think, though, to going just to the enforcement issue and some of the things that I read in Mr. Weddleton's white page that he just sent out today, I don't know how we would enforce some of those. So I would need more time to talk to APD and code enforcement on how we could incorporate those, either through site or use specific standards or through, okay, we're going to make a reporting requirement and they have to address these things. Because I don't know what the reality of enforcement is.
Okay, thanks. So Chris Schutte, you want to respond to Chris Constant. Once you do that, and then we'll go back to Meg's questions on kind of what interim solutions could be. So So Chris
Thank
Schutte?
you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I was going to answer Assemblymember Zalatal's question, and I think in the answer it
Okay.
will provide some additional detail to Assemblymember Constant. So, in summary, her question was, if there was a facility today located in the B3 that we needed to activate for homeless and transient shelter, could it be activated under the emergency shelter plan protocols authorized in AMC 16-120-030? And the answer is yes. So to her question of buying the Alaska Club and turning it into a homeless shelter, could that occur prior to this ordinance passing or some future ordinance about conditional use permits or special land use permits? Yes.
Okay.
What? Wait, one follow-up though. The piece I'm missing is, sorry, if I may, Mr. Chair,
No, please do. Yeah, go ahead.
is that
Thanks.
whatever code change we make ultimately, does it then apply to those that are operating under the emergency provision?
So through the chair, it would not, because the emergency shelter protocols in essence suspend certain provisions of Title 21 as it relates to the temporary use of a given facility for overnight shelter. So until, I believe, until such time as the emergency was turned off, deactivated, the conditional use or the conditional use permit or special land use permit conditions would not apply. Now, if there was a facility that was in the B3 operating as a homeless shelter and it was allowed to use the authority in 16-120-030 to provide that shelter, and then we came back and said, here's the actual process to go through to become a permanent homeless shelter, not an emergency homeless shelter, then they would have to go through all of those steps.
Yes, that's what I was looking for. Thank you, because that's the piece, so that it would go from being an emergency operation to a permanent operation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So where are we here? Is anybody else in the queue here? Chris, were you back?
Yeah, I'm
Constant?
back on that topic right there. I assumed that was the methodology that we would be using for standing up any of these shelters under the CARES Act model that we're looking at. Is it would be under the emergency shelter 16.120.030 after it was just stood up under the mayor's emergency power, right? So the mayor's emergency power takes effect, it's done. Then we recognize that because we have an emergency of homelessness, people are going to be thrown out on the streets, nowhere to go. These shelters do then qualify under the 030 section. And then we would require for them to convert once we determine the emergency is over, not just the pandemic emergency, but the homeless emergency that we now, if this process is done, have the capacity, therefore it's not an emergency use, require them to go through that. That's a phased method for us to get there, but this ordinance as written eliminates all of those protections that are built in, if I'm not mistaken. And we could, without going through planning and zoning, if we had problems, amend the emergency use code 16.120.030 to put whatever standards we need to protect the neighborhoods in the interim while we're waiting 6 to 9 months to get all of this worked out. Is that a fair assessment?
It sounds like something to Chris or Michelle.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure who the question was addressed to, Mr. Chairman. So, Chris Schutte, through the chair, Assemblymember Constant, I don't know that you would even need to modify Title 16 in order to accomplish that outcome. But I understand the way that you've structured it, the rationale. I believe it could be handled directly through. Well, let me think about that and actually get back to you, but I understand the way you're thinking, and I think it can be done even without a modification of Title 16, because keep in mind, Title 16 covers a lot of territory, including some of our religious assemblies that will host individuals overnight, et cetera. But I think the outcome you are desiring can be achieved, yes.
All right, thanks. Dean?
I was going to mention for the exemption to Title 21 under emergency powers, it's in Section 380.110. It says that the mayor should indicate the period of time for emergency sheltering and not used to be exempt from Title 21. Indicate the period of time not to exceed 2 years that such temporary structures are permitted. So I think that, we've got these 4 facilities in question. It might be within the mayor's, I guess, powers to say, we're exempting from zoning for these structures because of COVID-19 and then CDC guidance that we need to follow now for up to 2 years. And we'd have time, I think, within then to change code as we need to. I guess I'm saying that maybe we don't need to pass July 14th if the mayor can do this under emergency powers, at least going forward. But we do need to amend code anyways. And then the last sentence for that section also says the assembly may by resolution reduce or extend the time set by the mayor. This all has to be, I think, within the emergency powers. And I don't think it necessarily means that the 2 years and that the proclamation of emergency for COVID-19, if it ends, that the 2 years has to end then. I think it can be for that period that stayed there just for the zoning exemption. I hope I didn't make that sound more convoluted than it needed to be.
Oh, that's helpful. Thanks. I guess for the record, I should read in these chat comments, I think, and Michelle's got something in here. 2103.210.4a requires that any text amendments proposed that amend the powers and duties of any board or commission shall be reviewed by that board or commission, which shall forward a recommendation to the assembly. Thanks for that, Michelle. Meg, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to have to hop off because I'm supposed to be actually out of the house for an 11 o'clock. But I have an idea for moving forward from this conversation. And I think, excuse me, it really picks up with the work I was already doing on the sheltering regulation. We saw the need for a Title 21 piece as well as a health department piece to this. And I really feel like it's a package deal. And so I'm wondering if kind of work groups in both excuse me, in both instances aren't the way forward. They don't even necessarily have to be the same 2 work groups, because I think the Title 21 piece really is a separate piece from, it's what's happening outside the building versus what's happening inside the building. Before they are brought forward, I think that we should make sure that they don't contradict and that they have the same purpose, which I think they will, which will be quality care and no neighborhood impacts. So I think a couple of work groups moving forward would make a lot of sense. And keeping in mind that the Title 21 piece could take 6 months, I think it gives us this impetus to move it forward at a diligent speed. But knowing that we have the emergency provisions that if we need them, if we need to use them, but I think the best case scenario is moving forward under or within a code change.
All right, thanks. Chris Constant?
Yeah, thanks. I similarly agree that that's how we should proceed, whether it's a referral to planning and zoning or other commissions, public safety, etc., that will provide for us a third-party view of what protections are essential, because I don't want us to get so narrowly down the road of Title 21 of land use that we fail to see the forest through the trees. But it does seem to me that the administration currently has all the power it needs at its fingertips right now, and the will of the body to go with it under the emergency rubric, without opening this big hole that says as soon as we change this, an application is made, all bets are off. We're under the current climate, and because the current climate just ain't working. So I think that more review is a good idea.
Okay, thanks. Michelle, Dean asks, can the Planning and Zoning Commission do their review before July 14th?
No, it's subject to a public hearing. I actually, when I look at code, yeah, this would have to go out for the public notice, so it cannot.
Okay. All right,
Mr.
thanks.
Chair, if we were to send this out for public review, they would be reviewing the wrong question, I think.
Embellish on that, Chris?
Back to my previous comment that this ordinance as it stands has a bit of a hole that we've already identified, and that there are other concerns that need to be addressed if we're going to move licensing of these facilities into the B3 zoning, and therefore, what are the questions we're asking them? I don't think this ordinance actually gets there.
Right, no, I thought you meant the whole conditional use package thing, so I got you. Question to, I guess, administration folks. Were this ordinance to not pass or to be postponed, where does that leave you? And opening a shelter.
Through the chair, Chris Schutte, I'll let Jason Bockenstadt fill in the gaps, but I think to the points that several assembly members have made about whether or not approval of this ordinance impacts short-term steps that the administration's taking to establish transitional housing and treatment center options for Anchorage, I don't think that it impacts those decisions. However, as everybody on this call has heard and has expressed, it is a long-term needed change in conjunction with some additional tweaks to the conditional use permit process or special land use permit process in order to facilitate homeless shelter development in the future.
So so it's not critical that we have it right now, but it is important to move all of this forward expeditiously. Is that about right?
Through the chair, that's right. We are looking at the different projects that we're proposing to the assembly. We want those to be permanent solutions, and until the Title 21 changes are made that make those allowable on a permanent basis, we haven't really finished the job.
Okay, that's a good point. Thanks.
And this
question, Mr. Chair. Oh, go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
Well, this is Jason. I was just going to echo that I co-sign 100% of the comments that Mr. Schutte made. I agree with them completely, and it's something that we, as he said, don't need immediately, but to actually put together the entire package that we are working towards, we do need to do this here in the near future, though.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Mr. Chair.
Okay, we got about 5 more minutes. So Chris, go ahead and then we'll.
Yep. So the tactical question is, do we kill this item, postpone it indefinitely? Do we postpone it date specific, or do we refer it to the Planning and Zoning Commission with instructions or other commissions? And so that is what I think we should spend a few minutes talking about.
I'd like to share some of my experience with this. When I was on the Planning Commission, we had Carlick Manor conditional use in front of us. And it was a huge education, but we were not, it was so new to us that, nope, sorry about that. I think the sense on the commission then was, this is way out of our bounds. We don't know this topic. We don't have parameters for dealing with it. And what, sorry, I don't know how to turn off my other phone. So if you can hear that. So, if we just send this B3, it's like, I don't think, they don't have the parameters to deal with it. And I think if we send something to the Planning Commission, it should be maybe the whole package, with the B3 plus some parameters for potential conditional use to help provide some guidance.
I agree with you wholly there, and I think we should send it to our Public Safety Commission, and I think we might send it to the coalition and ask each of them to reply with the framework that they would see as essential frames around, or the cabins around, this use. Then we have not just the input of our land use people, but the input of our safety people and our homeless people.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea, Chris. Meg?
That is a great idea. The couple of times I've gone to commissions asking for them to do something kind of out of their norm, I've been hit with stone cold silence or no response or a lot of trepidation. So lesson learned. In terms of the coalition, I mean, this has been an ongoing conversation. They ultimately have to come up with a continuum of care set of guidelines. Those will deal with what's happening inside a facility. And since our code makes kind of a distinction there, I think that's just important to keep in mind. And they're going to have it very much from an operator's perspective. I don't think that they want to see adverse neighborhood impacts, of course, but I think it's kind of up to us as the policymakers to put forward a package and then get feedback on it. But I think having a package out as a starting point for discussion makes good sense, because we have a lot of really significant competing interests here that I think can be balanced, but we need a starting point for that conversation or we'll never get it fully off the ground.
Okay, Chris Schutte?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to agree with both Assembly Members Constant and Zolotel that at this point, we do believe that a viable option for the body to consider, and again, we recognize that there are others besides the administration that sponsored this particular ordinance, but one outcome that would be, I think, ideal would be to postpone this item indefinitely and allow us to put together, as a group, to put together the comprehensive Title 21 changes that everybody's discussing today, and use that as the vehicle for the communications and conversations with boards and commissions, councils, et cetera, so that they are looking at it in total.
Okay, and when you say in total, so the kind of a new ordinance that would have the allow these uses in B3, and that ordinance would also include conditional use parameters and maybe a special land use permit or something. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that is correct.
Okay, that'll be a fat ordinance, but that sounds the way to go. Okay, so just to move forward, so I sent something out, and like I said, it's kind of a brainstorm thing. It was stuff I see here, but also different places I'd visited in travels last year. And like one, they set up in Hollywood shelter, and to get neighborhood buy-in, they said the police patrol. So that, as Chris pointed out, won't always work. But if we had a list of, okay, these are things to consider, and then they also had no tolerance in a fairly large neighborhood. Because they have a shelter, you're not going to sleep on the sidewalk here. Actually, they're more gentle than that, but so I sent that out, and I think if that is helpful for, like Michelle said, how do we enforce it, who would do it, if you could kind of go with that and kind of pull out stuff, say impossible, or this would be Title 21, this would be some other code. And then Meg, if you are still on, if you could share your kind of where you are, if you have anything written up, and kind of add that to the mix. Is that possible?
Maybe the way.
Is that a yes? I'm sorry. Oop. Couldn't hear you there. Is that Meg?
Meg just sent me a text that she had to run. She wants to be on both working groups, the Title 21, as well as the kind of more neighborhood conditions, public safety, et cetera. And she says, I really don't want to lose track of what happens inside the building piece, which is the kind of operating rules of licensure. So she didn't specifically answer your question, John, but that was her take.
Okay, well, that's fine. So let's see here. Chris, you've spoken. And so Dean?
Yeah, I wondered about the timing. So I understood Mr. Schutte said maybe suggesting postponing definitely, so give time for reviews. I wondered if maybe postponing for in August or September maybe at least would keep it on the radar and give time for reviews, and at that time, scrap this ordinance for a new one, or continue with this ordinance and the work that's already been done with it, maybe an S version. I guess I'm suggesting not to take it off the radar by postponing indefinitely, but put a date on it, and then we'll have a better picture of how to go forward with this ordinance or a new one. But I guess the question is postponed to what meeting date? That's just my suggestion, as opposed to postponing indefinitely.
Okay. I think that's a Tuesday discussion for us, or 14th or whatever. Thanks. We've had a proposal then to have two committees looking at inside and outside. I guess, how is that done? Do we want to do that under the CEDC or something separate? Crystal?
Well, I think we can start with the CEDC. I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, it seems like it's in our purview, so let's do that. You know, and then we'll see if we can come up with something that we can then start to send out to different community groups. So I'm happy to do that.
So do we want to have like maybe, here's Monday, but have a Thursday meeting, kind of normal time that is fairly open, and then address these issues there together? Or
John, I do, and what I would like to see from that is a timeline, like let's come up with a roadmap of the process so we know where we're going.
Okay, so and that's at a future CEDC meeting, Chris, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, Crystal?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, yeah, let's just do it as soon as we can, you know, and the quickest thing we know of is to use the CEDC. So let's just do that and get going.
Okay. Okay, kind of out of time here. Mandy, I guess that's something to schedule.
Yeah, I took notes for that so I can get stuff set up. I'll probably chat with you guys before I get invitations and meetings set up and just make sure we have everything straight.
Okay. So anything else before we close it out? Dean, are you still in there?
I want to say thank you to everybody. This is a very difficult process, and I really do want to support this. And I can't yet, but I will.
Great, thanks. Anyone else? Okay, so we'll continue at a CEDC meeting. Oh, go ahead, Dean.
I was going to mention, well, they had started a work group independently, you know, as a legislator and on the shelter regulations in Title 16 process. So I think seeing if she's ready to bring that to the CEDC, we should ask her. But I think it makes sense for us to bring our work to the CEDC and go forward from there on this.
Okay. Well, I think if Meg has a group, a team she's working with on it, she could bring that up at a soon-to-happen CEDC meeting, and then that could be part of that whole timeline: who does what, when, and where, and so on. So that's good to know. But Dean, can you check with her then? Just tell her, see how she wants to approach that. Good.
Yeah,
anything else?
I need you. I'm working with her on it.
Good. Thank you. All right. I think we're done. Thanks, everyone. Or do I have to ask for adjournment?
Thanks, everyone.
I think the clock adjourned us.